Penguin Random House Audio presents The Land of Hope and Fear, Israel's Battle for Its Inner Soul, by Isabel Kershner, read for you by Romy Nordlinger. Prologue. I drive past the Israeli Prime Minister's residence on the leafy corner of Balfour Street in West Jerusalem. The roads are strangely quiet. The house dark. Nobody is home. For a year, this busy junction was the epicenter of possibly the most sustained and raucous protest movement in Israel's history, as the country seemed to be tearing itself apart. On Saturday nights, thousands gathered outside the walled, stone-clad mansion where Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's longest-serving prime minister, was ensconced. The king of Israel to his many admirers, his detractors accused him of having turned Balfour into an imperial castle ruled by members of the royal household. When he was charged with corruption, the Israelis were roughly split between those who believed he had been framed by a liberal deep state and those who desperately wanted to see him go. The protesters of all ages came in costumes, with megaphones and homemade signs, some with flashing lights. They sang, beat on kitchen pots, banged on drums, blew on horns, and chanted for Bibi to quit until they were hoarse. After midnight, the hardcore would sit down on the road and brave the jets of police water cannons. 7 decades after the founding of the state, Israel was doubtless a modern miracle, a regional superpower, and a prosperous and innovative country projecting might to the world. But from the inside it felt more divided than ever, its population polarized and splintered, an immigrant startup nation breaking down into its component parts. The country had long been shifting to the right. The socialist founders were dying out. Generational change, instead of erasing old resentments and arguments, had brought ideological, religious, ethnic, and national tensions to the fore. The modern state was supposed to be an enlightened haven for the Jews in their ancient homeland. Now its future as a Jewish, liberal democracy was on the line. Too internally fractured to establish an agreed-upon border with the Palestinians in the long-occupied territories, the Israelis were entangled in identity conflicts and culture wars as their toxic politics threatened to trample the rule of law. Israel had largely learned to live with its outside enemies, but seemed less adept at managing itself. In the spring of 2021, Netanyahu was ousted after a 4th tumultuous election in the space of 2 years. The lights were turned off at Balfour as it underwent renovations. A new generation of leaders emerged. But who were the Israelis, and what did they aspire to? This book takes in the chaotic culmination of Netanyahu's extended run of 12 years in power, followed by a year of relative and precarious normalcy under a fragile new government. Netanyahu's defeat in 2021 initially felt like the end of an era, restoring a veneer of calm and functional governance. It would not last long. Netanyahu's legacy and presence continued to cast a long shadow and was likely to affect the course of the Jewish state in the years to come. Israel's problems did not end with that election. They would not end with the next one or go away anytime soon. This is a portrait of a country on the precipice, battling for its inner soul. 1. Desert Corals. My quest to explore the soul of the new Israel began with a journey to the biblical wilderness of the southern desert. There, in a small farming community, lived Asaf Shaham, the native son of hardy Zionist pioneers, who in the 1950s had obstinately moved to the Arava, a sun-scorched, sparsely populated, barren strip of backcountry along Israel's then hostile border with Jordan. A first-chance meeting with Shaham had come years earlier during a press tour of the area to promote Israel's expertise in arid agriculture. Shaham struck me as an archetypal new Israeli, authentic and rooted, but also worldly and enterprising. He had spent years living elsewhere, but once he had a family of his own, he was drawn back to the remote community of his birth, Indyk, a tiny speck on the map inhabited by a few hundred souls. At first encounter, Shaham, a farmer innovator, seemed to be living the Zionist dream, and in many ways he was. A bona fide son of the land, whose parents were born at around the same time as the state, and a product of his generation of high-tech entrepreneurs. The Israel beyond Indyk had fundamentally changed, divided, and fragmented, and was in political turmoil. But perhaps Shaham had cracked the secret of inner peace and purpose in the Jewish homeland. My journey began with the ear-popping descent down to the Dead Sea from Jerusalem. The drive from the holy city to the lowest point on earth is a trip through folds of time, but also one through the complex strata of modern Israel. The car sped along the newly asphalted highway in blinding sunlight through the stark, almost primordial landscape of the Judean desert, through an Israeli military checkpoint into the occupied West Bank, and past a sprawling Jewish settlement perched along a beige ridgetop, past ramshackle Bedouin encampments of hide tents, tin shacks, and pens for livestock. About halfway down the steep incline, a large turquoise-tiled sign on the roadside marked sea level. An overly adorned camel waited stoically for travelers to take a photo, as if in a picture postcard. The bone-dry hills spread out in the distance like the bed of a waterless ocean. To the left, the Palestinian oasis town of Jericho lay in a haze. The road twisted rightward, hugging the shore of the receding Dead Sea, glistening with salt. Dramatic beige cliffs lined the other side of the highway, pocked with the dark mouths of caves that once provided refuge for the ancient rebels of the Jewish revolt against the Romans. Through another military checkpoint marking entry back into Israel proper, and past the desert fortress of Masada, the deeper toward the Earth's core, the thicker the atmosphere became. Beyond the hotel district near ancient Sodom, and after the grotesque industrial Dead Sea chemical plant, the Salt Lake was abruptly swallowed up by the Arava Desert. It was still another hour's drive along Route 90 to Indyk through the moonscape-like Great Rift Valley abutting the Jordanian border. The wind-sculpted cliffs tapered out into a monotonous plain, broken only by flat-topped, thorny acacia bushes, providing dappled patches of shade. In this harsh, inhospitable terrain, the Zionist enterprise had been boiled down to its essence, though when I arrived at Indyk, it struck me as surprisingly lush. Still a flagship of Jewish settlement in the area, it operated as a moshav, a rural cooperative that was a model of old labor Zionism, the movement that had laid the foundations of the state, but had almost become obsolete in 21st century Israel. Remote by Israeli standards, this being a relatively compact country, Indyk lay about 140 miles from Tel Aviv on the Mediterranean coast. The closest cities, Beersheba and Eilat, were both a 90-minute drive away. When Asaf's father, Ami Shacham, first arrived in the Arava in 1959, barely more than a decade after the establishment of the state, it was even less accessible. But in those years, life here was a mission. Just a decade earlier in 1949, Israeli forces...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?